You're listening to the Perch Pod from Perch Perspectives. Hello, listeners, and welcome to the Cognitive Dissidence Podcast, or as I like to say, the artist previously known as the Perch Pod. We're so glad you're here. Thanks for making the transition over from the Perch Pod feed and signing up for Cognitive Dissidence. We're really excited to produce a lot more content for you more regularly. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm the Director of Geopolitical Analysis at Cognitive Investments. You can write to me at jacob@cognitive.investments with any questions, comments, concerns, things you want on the podcast. If you're an expert and you want to be on the podcast, email me. I'd love to get all of your feedback. So thanks for being here. Please spread the word. Please rate, leave a review, all those sorts of good things. All that stuff really helps for us. Joining me on the podcast today is Brian O'Toole. Brian is a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center. He's also the senior vice president and director of sanctions and screening at Truist Financial Corporation. Previously, Brian worked at the U.S. Department of the Treasury from 2009 to 2017 as senior advisor to the director of the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, where he managed the implementation of all OFAC-administered economic and financial sanctions programs. I reached out to Brian on Twitter to come on the podcast, and he was nice enough to say yes, and I really appreciate him doing so, even though he doesn't know me from Adam. I've been asked about sanctions a lot over the past couple weeks, and truth be told, I'm not a sanctions expert at all, and Brian is. So I was really excited to have a chance to have Brian on and for me to ask him all those simple questions that not even I can answer. I think more about geopolitics, and a lot of times when I have guests on, I can hang with my guests, but in this particular case, Brian is a real subject matter expert, and I think he dropped some really great insights. I certainly learned a lot from this conversation, and I hope you will as well. So without any further ado, you know where to check us out online or to write to us with your feelings about the podcast. Take care. We will see you out there. Brian, thanks for accepting a random reach out from a dude on Twitter to come on this podcast. I appreciate it.
No, you engaged in a reasonable discussion of issues, and on a platform that's notoriously unreasonable in those discussions. So it seemed a pretty safe yes to say on my part.
Well, I appreciate that. And I also, you mentioned that you were banging your head on your desk from whatever previous meeting you came to. So hopefully this podcast will feel, restorative in some possible way. Is that
much more enjoyable than what I've been dealing with the rest of the day? Yes.
We should also note we're recording on April 13th. Things are changing so much with sanctions day by day that even if we get this out on Monday, like we're hoping some things might change. So, this is current as of April 13th, listeners. So we appreciate your patience and generosity. So, Brian, in some ways, I have a list of questions and I don't know where to start. I thought maybe the best place to start would maybe be to get some context, which is, when the initial sanctions came out from the U.S. and Europe against Russia, everybody was talking about what a big deal they were, and the ruble crashed, and all these terrible things were happening. And as we sit here like 6 weeks later, the ruble is apparently back. Sanctions are still on, but it's almost like we've become normalized to them or anesthetized to them. I'm not sure. So I wanted to start with just, was that first salvo of sanctions, what was so special about them? Did it really break some kind of precedent? Was it really as serious as everyone was making it out to be? Or was it more kind of superficially serious, but obviously the Russians have been able to get out from underneath the worst implications of it?
It is incredibly serious, and the Russians have managed to pull the ruble back to the low 80s instead of low 70s, where it was before the crisis, and down from the figures are a little off because some people got quoted at 155, 159, but stabilized somewhere in the 1 teens. They're back down in the low 80s. From smoke and mirrors. They raised interest rates to 20%. They've since dropped it to 17.5%. They imposed capital controls, right? Like classic collapsing economy capital controls. They're using foreign exchange earned from energy sales to intervene in currency markets overseas to create demand for rubles. And they've effectively artificially propped up the ruble with their FX reserves and the capital controls. If you're an ordinary Russian, you cannot move foreign currency overseas right? That's a huge deal. And so, the calculation, presumably from Nabiulina and others in the Russian kind of economic sphere, probably we can weather this for some period of time without causing major dislocation, and create this artificial, show of defiance, and then hopefully this all passes.
Mm-hmm.
They can't do this forever, right? Venezuela shows us well what happens when you don't invest in oil infrastructure, which is what oil sales go towards a lot of times. They can't keep this up for very long. There's just only so many rubles that exist outside of Russia anyway for them to keep buying up. And at some point they're going to run out. And then, there was some indication, I think I saw a quick news report yesterday, the day before, saying that they opened up trading a little bit more broadly in the ruble, and it started to drop precipitously. So they had to pull the reins back in. Right? So they're artificially controlling this.
If I was to play devil's advocate on the Venezuela example, the Maduro regime is still there. They haven't actually changed their behavior in any fundamental way because of all those sanctions. So I guess to put my finger on it, how long can Russia last, and can they evade sanctions longer than it's going to take them to consolidate whatever position they have in Ukraine?
So look, I've long been one to say that, and I'll borrow the phrase from my colleague Julia Friedlander, sanctions don't stop tanks, right? And I think that's true. Sanctions work slower than the military. They can have an effect, right? There's been some scattered reporting about, impeded supply chains, things of that nature. And so they can certainly help kind of around the margins, but fundamentally what's stopping the Russian tanks are the Ukrainian people, the weapons the West is providing, and kind of that whole policy. So sanctions can work alongside those things to have an impact on the military side. The Venezuela example was more of one about not reinvesting your profits in your infrastructure for oil, right? Venezuela famously has basically strip mined their oil revenues for corruption purposes to keep the Maduro regime, and prior to that, the Chavez regime, afloat. And their oil production has dropped accordingly, right? It was a huge oil producer. They're sitting on probably the largest proven reserves on the planet, as I understand it, or pretty close to it. But they don't pump anything near what anybody else pumps because they simply can't get it out of the ground. They haven't invested for years. They have this dilapidated infrastructure, and it's a huge problem. And that was kind of the parallel I was drawing. To the broader point, though, about, well, Venezuela is still there, Iran's still there, North Korea is still there. My kind of retort to that is Russia going to tolerate being in those places, right? Mm-hmm. You can't get basic things in a lot of those jurisdictions, including in Iran, which is better off than either of the other two. Venezuela and North Korea constantly suffer from food shortages, medicine shortages, regardless of the fact that sanctions allow those things to go in. And, the social compact, as it were, that Vladimir Putin established with the Russian people, and in my view, and this is all informal, of course, it's not like anything formal, but like the essential deal with Putin in the mid-2000s was him saying to the Russian people, look, I'm going to roll back some of your freedoms, but you're not waiting in line for bread anymore the way you did under Yeltsin, so be quiet and deal with it. So rising tide lifts all boats. Russia rode a huge commodities boom to increased wealth. There was a middle class of sorts that was created. There was the ultra wealthy that everybody knows about. Right, things got better for Russians for a long time. Since 2014, things have gotten worse for Russians, and now they're getting a lot worse, a lot faster. And at some point, that's going to come back to bite them. Right, the people like to think that these governments are monoliths, are adversaries. Both from the Western perspective, but it's a common mistake everybody makes in international relations. They're not. Like at some point, this stuff is going to come back to bite Putin. And the Russian people living as the Venezuelan people do, or as the North Korean people do, is probably even too much for the kind of legendary kind of patience of the Russian people, but like ability to endure of the Russian people would be the way I would frame it.
Yeah, that's a nice way of euphemizing their ability to tolerate suffering.
Just so freaking cold there. I'm convinced that's like 80% of it is like it's so freaking cold in Russia that they can put up with terrible government.
It is really cold and it's really dark too. I was invited
Yeah.
to Moscow a couple times to speak at conferences, and it was always in December. And I always thought when they invited me in the spring or the summer is when I'd know that they actually took me seriously. But I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, based on how things are going. You were talking about the Russian people and the middle class and the rich, and this was another question that I've always struggled with, which is there a way to target sanctions that goes after the Russian government without going after the Russian people? Or are sanctions just too blunt an object and you just basically have to say, all right, we don't like that we have to go after the Russian people here, but the strategy really is make things bad for people on the ground, and that puts pressure on the government?
Yeah. In 2014, the answer to that question is yes, when there were limited kind of Russian objectives and limited, kind of limited objectives for the sanctions. And what happened in 2014 that screws everybody up with this is that Putin imposed that ridiculous food import ban. So Russian people actually got hurt, but it wasn't because of Western sanctions. It was because Putin essentially took away food imports. So food inflation spiked like 25, 30% overnight almost. So in 2014, the answer to that question is yes. When the discussion becomes around, and this is, I think, is key, right? Like, this isn't just Ukraine, right? The way that Washington and Brussels and London and Berlin and Paris view this is not just about Ukraine. This is about fundamentally fracturing NATO. And as Fiona Hill has pointed out, this is about essentially like the recreation of Tsarist Russia, which is bigger than the USSR. And when that's the threat, right, the undermining of like this basic democratic order that has provided, the biggest growth in wealth in the history of humankind, et cetera, right? Like human rights, largely peaceful Europe since World War II, setting aside, like the Balkans conflict and some other things like that. That kind of a magnitude of threat means you just can't spare the Russian people because sanctions are too blunt then, and there's not enough impact you can have by just going after rich Russians. Rich Russians connected to the government can always hide underneath the wings of the Kremlin. Right? You're always going to have some domestic industry, and Russia is the biggest landmass on earth. So, there's always going to be some of that there, and an ability for kind of the corrupt and the cronies and the various and sundry bootlickers to kind of keep themselves in a better position than the serfs, I guess, if you want to go way back in Russian history, or maybe not even that far back, to bring that kind of spectra. But I think, that's a little bit, I think, of how these guys see themselves as compared to like ordinary Russians still. It's remarkable that mentality hasn't changed.
Yeah. Has the wider adoption of cryptocurrency changed the math here at all? And I mean, either way, does it allow Russian oligarchs to surpass sanctions easier? Does it allow the common Russian serf to sort of buy products more easily? Is there a pro and negative at the same time? Or is it really just, look, crypto is still the speculative thing being traded by guys with their stimulus checks? It's not actually affecting the crisis that much in Russia, Ukraine in any meaningful way. Where should I fall on that spectrum?
Bunch of guys that live in San Francisco don't care anything about Ukraine, from that famous investor, multimillionaire out there who said that right before the crisis started. Look, the ordinary Russian, and I would not call an ordinary Russian a serf. I think that's how some of their leadership thinks about it. But right, ordinary Russians could use crypto to try to move kind of assets out of the country potentially, right? Because you're talking about relatively small amounts for them. In which case, crypto could be good, right? Crypto could help with a whole bunch of things. Richer Russians, like oligarchs, plutocrats, magnates, whatever you want to call them, on the margins, right? You're not buying a $600 million yacht or somehow hiding that by using crypto. There's just only so much you can do, and the notwithstanding kind of Bitcoin's anonymity on either end of the transaction, for most crypto, the actual like meat of the transaction, the blockchain, is public, and there are a lot of firms that track it the same way that there are people who follow these yachts around the world or who do plane spotting and uncovered, right, like the CIA rendition program shortly after 9/11 kind of stuff, right? These people figure it out just by watching planes land, right? So, in my view, the crypto watchers are kind of the same way, where they can figure some of this stuff out, especially if the money movements are large. And so I've always thought that crypto is kind of useful on the margins as like a utility of, can you move a couple $1,000,000 here or there? Sure. Fundamentally, does that matter for the sanctions the U.S. is imposing on Russia? Absolutely not. Would that matter for a narco trafficker or a terrorist, a weapons, like a WMD procurement agent? Like, yes, that's where I see the threat of crypto and sanctions being much more acute, but not for, I've made the pithy comment before, right? Like crypto's for, narcos and weapons smugglers. It's not for bailing out the 11th largest economy on the planet. It's just not going to be.
Yeah, it's not there yet. Sort of the last question, context-wise, before we zoom into some of the stuff that's happening right now. If I'm a strategic decision maker in China or in any other country that might be subject to U.S. sanctions in the future, is there anything that the U.S. has done so far to Russia that sort of makes me stand up straighter in my chair, that sort of makes me say, the U.S. hasn't done that before and we could be uniquely vulnerable to that? Or is the U.S. using a suite of tools that it's used in different cases in the past, maybe rarely, but that there's been nothing unprecedented on the table?
I don't know that there's been anything unprecedented except for the size of the Russian economy and the importance of the Russian central bank, which is a big deal, right? And I think there may have been certain corners of those who watch China, since that's really the only like truly relevant example here, who may have been surprised by the willingness to do it. I actually saw a piece out of Nikkei this morning from an interview I did last week, where some Chinese folk, Chinese policy people were pontificating about how, like, we can't believe the U.S. would go after the foreign reserves of a central bank, et cetera, et cetera. And I kind of read that and thought, like, what hole they've had their head in for the last couple of decades. I mean, Libya in 2011 was a pretty glaring example of going after a central bank and all of its foreign exchange reserves. And in fact, in Libya, it imposed essentially a trade embargo by going after only the central bank. Iran's central bank and their reserves have been a serious point of discussion for the last 15 years. And so like these things have been out there. Now, Libya, which was taken in 2011 as a kind of massive example of blocked funds, was $37 billion ish at the end of the day, blocked in the United States. Call it around 100-ish around the world. That's an order of magnitude smaller than the Russian central bank.
Yeah.
And so those things matter, and the decoupling with China is a little different, and there are other nuances there. But I think that's why governments have smart people, is to understand what those nuances are and how you can hurt the other guy more than you're hurting yourself. But you absolutely have to. But without a doubt, sanctions on China are much, even compared to Russia, are a much different kettle of fish. I mean, it's just, the economy is so much bigger. China makes stuff people need. Russia pulls stuff out of the ground, and they, not to kind of one-dimensionalize them as an economy, because that's unfair and not really true. It's not, as some people said, like just a giant petrol station. But they don't fit into the global supply chains with the same kind of level of irreplaceability as China does.
Yeah, to the extent that Russia's improved, it's just that it extracts more in different things. So now they're a petrol station and a wheat station and a corn station and a nickel station. But like, to your point, they don't actually make a bunch of things that are going to cause people to think twice.
Yeah, you've got scarce resources, but China, right, is like an integral part of the supply chain for a whole bunch of stuff that people rely on, like absolutely for day to day. That like decoupling has started to happen, right? Of course, as I'm sure. But it's slow, it's painful, and it's the idea of having to do it as quickly as has been done with Russia is look, it might end up there if they flatten Taiwan and decide to march on over there, or float on over there, I guess. But that's also a big, scary problem. Beyond even potentially what the Russians are doing right now.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to happen. But we'll come back to China in just a little bit. I to kind of move it to a different place. And you wrote an excellent article that we're going to link to in the description of the podcast about, and this was back in March, about additional things the U.S. could do. I wanted to ask you, So what else can the US and Europe do sanction wise? I mean, obviously oil and natural gas is on the table, and we're going to talk just about kind of energy after this. But are there things that the US can still do? Has the US pulled any of its punches, or has the US basically done everything it can do short of getting the Europeans to sanction oil and natural gas?
The U.S. has done quite a lot, right? It's taken out the biggest banks, for the most part. It's gone after the central bank, but there are still a whole bunch of kind of big important companies that could be sanctioned, and some of them have been sanctioned by the UK or EU. And it seems to me like job one for the White House and those who are planning this stuff out is probably like equalizing sanctions. Somehow the U.S. is like a little bit behind some of the others. Discounting Sparebank, which hasn't been sanctioned to the same degree and across the pond. But like the U.S. hasn't done Sovcomflot, the U.S. hasn't done Sogaz, the large state-owned insurance company that was actually linked to the Rotenberg brothers. There's a whole swath of Russian industry that could be gone after. There's a whole swath of banks that still remain. Most of the big fish are gone, but Gazprom Bank is still out there. The UK has sanctioned Gazprom Bank, and there's a whole bunch of complications with that one, of course. But there's that, and then oil and gas, right, is the big like ticket item that remains before you impose essentially a full financial embargo, which is, I think, kind of the last big step. And a lot of what happens after that is what you see with Iran and North Korea and others, just like cleaning up, right? So you've sanctioned the big stuff, and now you've got to go after all the little like evasion networks and getting. The way I always think about it is like a continuum of like a 0 to 100% of the impact sanctions can have. And even Iran is at, say, 95, somewhere in that like 92 to 95% range. But like going from 95 to 100 is really, really hard because you got to play whack-a-mole, right? It's just, that's the game you play constantly because it's easy to set up front companies. North Korea is a good demonstration of this because it's, when China pays attention, North Korea goes from like 92 to 97 on that meter, 98. And that tends to actually force them to try to take things a little more seriously in terms of negotiations and stuff. And the Trump administration actually got there. They got to Singapore, and then everything went to hell from there. But notwithstanding President Trump having a photo op with his buddy Kim, and all of the insanity of that, like the people working in his administration, including U.S. UN up in New York, did a fabulous job of actually getting the Russians and the Chinese to pay attention and care about it. That's hard to do.
Where so if Iran is a 92 or a 95, where is Russia on your scale right now?
I have trouble pushing Russia past like 75 without oil and gas going down. I think that's a big chunk, right? That takes you up to close to. I mean, if they did oil and gas, that probably, I would say Russia's probably in the like 65 to 70 range. And if you do oil and gas, it goes from say 65 to like 85. Since that's so much of their external receivables that if you've done oil and gas entirely, there's other stuff you can do, but it's like small potatoes compared to it, including the full financial embargo, which is a big deal and cuts off a bigger swath, a bigger kind of group of things. But the impact is not as kind of directly felt in the Kremlin because there's just, oil and gas is so much of their foreign, earnings.
Yeah. Do you think that the Europeans are going to do oil and gas? This is probably the question I get the most, and I have said, no, I don't think they're going to do it. But I wonder if you agree or if you see it differently.
There have been a number of ideas floated about setting up an Iran-style significantly reducing construct where they would significantly reduce imports and earnings or payments for those commodities would go into essentially blocked accounts overseas. It could be used for like improved bilateral trade, like textile trade or something like that. And then I've seen a preponderance of just absolutely baffling references to just set up oil for food program for Russia, as if people forget what happened in the 90s with oil for food and what a flaming wreckage of a policy that was. It's just like the short-term memory people have is just remarkable sometimes. Just go read the report. So like there's some like steps you could take along the way to get there without having to go full scale, which I think is probably more likely than going cold turkey. But I also didn't think the central bank would be sanctioned in the first like 10 days of the war, and it was. And so, like these things can happen quickly. And honestly, the thing that I've always, you made the disclaimer at the top of this that we're filming, taping this on the 13th and it will come out several days later. Right. We don't have any fidelity on whether a chemical weapon was used in Mariupol. Right. If Zelensky is assassinated, what's the reaction, right? If they suddenly go and carpet bomb Kyiv or something, like you could conceive of a parade of horribles that are well within the realm of the tactics Putin and this new commanding general have used in Syria for the last 11 years, which is super depressing to even think about. And those things provoking a response that says, all right, that's enough. We just, we don't care about the hit to the European economy, the world economy. Like we need to not have World War III.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because, and I worry that this is a failure of my own imagination, but can it really get that much worse? I mean, like, let's say, the scenario, like, let's say Russia goes for Transnistria and Moldova, or let's say they get to assassinate Zelensky, even like a chemical weapons attack, which doesn't make any sense to me militarily. It literally achieves no objectives. But like, aren't the pictures outside of Kyiv and all these terrors that we're unearthing right now, like if that's not enough, are these other things really going to be the moment where it goes? The cynic in me is sort of like, well, if this is what we've got now, with it's fresh on everybody's minds, the conflict is still quite not normalized yet, this is probably as good as we're going to go. And I understand the Europeans don't want to have 20% demand destruction of their energy consumption. No government is going to want to try and make that thing. So do you think I'm failing to understand like how that might switch based on something like that?
So sometimes, even as bad as Bucha is, and what everybody assumes is the case in Mariupol, it's when stuff starts playing over again on the evening news at like 6 p.m. in all these capitals, and you never know what's going to grab public attention sometimes. And some of these things have. And even what's happened in Mariupol, right? If it's, what Mike Carpenter, who's the U.S. ambassador to OSCE, has said, is there might be some use of like an expanded like riot control. It's like kind of a chemical weapon, but not really. I don't really understand all of the kind of like details on it, but like, if they suddenly drop a bunch of chlorine gas on a big population center and you've got bodies of little kids lying everywhere, maybe that's something that catches hold. But these news cycles are unpredictable, and I think that's a bit of the challenge. And it's awful to have to think about it that way because I had a conversation with somebody who made the very astute point of like, talk about like holding back sanctions for escalation ladders as a normal kind of policy issue. But is that the flip side of that is essentially saying, well, the Russians haven't killed enough people to deploy X or Y as part of your sanctions response. And there's no response you can't say anything to that because it's absolutely right. As for your question of whether this can get worse, absolutely. Right. Like what if they cross into Romania, right? There have been, U.S. surveillance flights back and forth along that Moldova transition, Moldova-Romania border. What if they, there were some unconfirmed reports about Russia moving armaments to the Finnish border and stuff like that. It's just like there are all these things that can happen. Strike going to Poland, and then it is World War III, right? Because NATO is gonna jump into action. sanctions at that
Yeah.
point, in my view.
Yeah. At that point, we're no longer talking about sanctions.
Yeah. And this is another one of my points too. It's like, we shouldn't be worried about having to, from like a Western perspective, save sanctions to like help deter Russia after they've done whatever's going to happen in Ukraine from crossing into Poland. Like NATO's military threat should be enough, especially after how badly Russia's military has performed. There's no reason to hold sanctions in reserve for NATO territorial defense. That's just a kind of I think people will default to that, but it's a silly kind of distinction.
Yeah, no, I agree. If we zoom out a little bit, I wanted to talk a little bit about secondary sanctions too, because as you kind of alluded to, sanctions really become powerful when you get everybody on the same team and you can force multiply one country's actions. The U.S. is very powerful, but even the U.S. by itself cannot do a lot of things here. And obviously the U.S. threatened China fairly early on here with, we're going to do these secondary sanctions against your companies if you support the Russians or engage with the Russians. U.S. hasn't really gone through with some of that. The U.S. has been, I would argue, positively friendly towards India based on how India has been acting towards Russia and all of this and the opportunity they see for getting cheap oil. So the question there is, are there secondary sanctions that you think can make a difference here? Do you think that countries, whether they're a competitor like China or an ally or pragmatic partner like India, that the threat of secondary sanctions is going to bring them on board? And do you think the U.S. is even considering that? Or do you think India, China, some of these other countries are going to do whatever they're going to do? And it's going to the ball is going to be in the U.S.'s court, whether it wants to go after some of these countries in the context of rising inflation and all these other problems the Biden administration is dealing with.
I think the threat of secondary sanctions is having an effect. I think, the challenge is, from Beijing's perspective, there's no way for Beijing to say, yeah, we're not going to do this because the U.S. threatened us, right? Like, that's just not a tenable political statement to make. And the same thing goes for Delhi. So I think the challenge with thinking about when secondary sanctions, as much as I hate that terminology because it's not actually kind of legally accurate to what secondary sanctions are, but for the purposes of where the world has moved to, I have to suck it up and ditch my wonky arguments on it.
No, you don't. You get to do whatever you want. Please tell us the right words to use. People who listen to this podcast want truth.
Anymore, because it's like a Venn diagram where like some of it falls under what people think it is, but most of what people think it is isn't secondary sanctions. In any event, OFAC has the ability to sanction whoever the hell they want, secondary sanctions constructs or no. So it's all artificial and it's all policy is kind of the biggest thing. And so like, when does policy suggest, your policy considerations suggest you need to do something, right? With India, like they haven't formalized anything. Buying Russian energy is not illegal, which is what they're talking about. There's not really anything to do there right now. If they were sending weapons to the Russians, which of course the flow goes the other way, but if they're sending weapons to the Russians, that'd be a different story. Same thing with China. Chinese companies are not jumping into this for a variety of reasons. And I think the same would be true of Indian companies as well. Like they have their own motives. Whatever the threats that come out of China, and there are many, one thing that is at least somewhat reassuring about China, setting aside the Taiwan issue, is their self-interest is a little bit easier sometimes to calculate because they do stick to dollars and cents more than the Russians do. Mm-hmm. There is more, frankly, my take on this, there's more accountability in China to the people of China, in Beijing, at least to the people of China, than there is from the Kremlin to the people of Russia. Sliding scales, of course, but I think China pays attention more and does more to kind of help the people of China than Putin's regime does. So you can calculate some of the Chinese response based on China's not just going to bail Russia out for the sake of bailing them out. That's not in China's interests. Their companies are going to lose a ton of money. Russia's a sinking ship. Why throw good money after that? I think those are there. They, of course, will take some pot shots. we've signed an agreement, quote unquote. Agreement may not turn into anything, right? We heard a lot in 2014 about Russia pivoting to China and how that was going to like insulate them from U.S. sanctions, et cetera, et cetera. Nothing ever happened. The Chinese didn't want what the Russians were selling. Even the gas pipeline they supposedly agreed to build that never got built. Right. There are all of these exploratory agreements and stuff that could get signed. But at the end of the day, when you're making a choice about sanctioning, especially in China, a very large institution, or potentially in India, a strategically important company for a kind of country we hope to keep a little bit on the straight and narrow, given their issues both east and west. I think you have to have really concrete stuff to go on, and right now there's so much speculation, but very little fire behind all the smoke everybody is supposedly seeing in the need to impose secondary sanctions. Is my feel for it. Is there's not enough there for the White House to be taking action. So that's kind of where my head is on it. I think there has to be something significant, something obvious, something big for them to do anything, and I haven't seen anything like that.
Do you think it was mostly an empty threat then, or because it's not good if the White House is making empty threats?
I don't think so, because I think some of the gold threats were actually the big ones. You gold traders in China, if you engage in trading Russia's gold reserves and then converting them to dollars to give to the Russians, we're coming after you. I think those threats are, they don't always have to be explicit threats, but remind you that if you conduct this transaction and it comes to the United States, you are liable, right? The Department of Justice will go after you. OFAC will go after you. You will be out of business, period. Things like that make a difference. And then there's strategic discussions with the Chinese about, frankly, if you're Ambassador Burns, if I were Ambassador Burns over in Beijing, the discussions I would be having with the Chinese would be probably less about, and it probably includes some, but less about the specific threats to China and more about, these are all of the 700 reasons why helping Russia would be a really bad idea for you. And there's a whole bunch of, you're going to lose money. You can't afford to lose that money. You've got to bail out all these real estate companies that have overinvested and don't have anybody to buy the apartments. And you're sitting on they're sitting on like a landmine of a real estate bubble, right, as they have been for a long time. And so they don't have as much room for error as I think people assume the Chinese do. The Chinese certainly don't have as much economic room for error as the U.S. does.
Yeah. And I think you were talking about the social contract with Russia. I think for the Russians, it was really Putin brought stability. For the Chinese, it's still, we need prosperity here before we're going to allow kind of the stability argument to take root. And my sense is that's where the Chinese government is at. But like you said, I've had to eat my own fair share of humble pie because a lot of things have happened in the last 8 weeks that I didn't expect. So I guess everything's a little bit up for grabs.
Yeah, so somebody pointed out to me a number of years ago, and I have no idea if this stat is still the case, but they said, look, China's got 30 million college graduates who need jobs every single year. And they care about that kind of because they have to. There's so many of them. And so they are more answerable. And, look, the idea of prosperity is a little different, especially compared to coast to inland and all that kind of stuff. But it still matters there in a way it doesn't matter in Russia for at least the governments.
Yeah, for sure. Brian, before I let you go, because I know you're busy and probably have a bunch of things to do, I just wanted to close with sort of the last question. We've already kind of danced around it, but I thought I would ask directly, which is, do sanctions even work? There was that Peterson Institute paper a couple of years ago that was like, oh, it's only 16% of the time does the U.S. get what it wants out of it. And in some ways, that's kind of a, I don't know how you come up with that figure. 85% of all statistics are made up. But I will say it does feel to me, at least from a subjective point of view, that when the U.S. has a problem, sanctions. Like Xinjiang, Uyghurs, sanctions. North Korea, nuclear weapons, sanctions. Iran, sanctions. Venezuela, sanctions. Cuba, sanctions. There are all these problems that don't actually get resolved. And I think some of that is just because, there's sanctions and then there's actual total policy. And just I think a lot of times the US mistakes sanctions for policy when sanctions are really just a tool. But as somebody who thinks about sanctions all the time, is the Biden administration using sanctions well? Has any government in the last, 4 administrations used sanctions well from your point of view? How can sanctions be used to actually further U.S. foreign policy rather than to just sort of virtue signal that we're mad about something?
You're never going to get away from some of the virtue signaling, I think, just because that's what governments do. I always bristle at this question a little bit because nobody ever says oh, diplomacy's failed with North Korea, we should stop talking to them. Right, because it's the same thing, right? Sanctions are just a tool of diplomacy, and so too many people try to ascribe this. And I forget, somebody did a survey of academics before the Russia invasion, and 87% of the academics surveyed thought that sanctions should be the tool the U.S. turns to if Russia invades Ukraine. But of course, those same 87% of academics are probably have written a bunch of papers saying, like Peterson saying, it only works 16% of the time, right? So where the hell do you make up that delta? And it is what it is, right? Policy sometimes sucks for any variety of reasons. People have to lose attention to it. We have transitions in power where somebody's not continuing a coherent policy. The Trump administration was especially prone to slapping sanctions on it and just hoping the problem would go away. To a certain degree, the Obama administration struggled with that too, and sanctions under Bush were a little bit of a different animal, just because it was a little. They were so much more focused on terrorism issues that back then. I think the Biden administration is trying to do it better, and I think they're making some progress there. Is it perfect? No, of course not. But it's all about measuring success is all about figuring out. Well, what's the policy, right? What are sanctions designed to achieve? And sanctions are always useful if you can define a kind of discrete objective for them. You can translate impact, right, economic impact, into some sort of political movement or whatever you need, and then grade them as part of an overall policy approach, right? You could argue, and I argue, that sanctions in 2014 were meant to basically buy political and diplomatic space to get a negotiation. That turned into Minsk and Minsk II, and looked at in that very narrow lens, sanctions succeeded. That policy, of course, failed. Right, both those things never went anywhere, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why that's the case, including probably many that I don't even fully appreciate, having been involved in it very closely. Sanctions on Libya in 2011 were wildly successful. Gaddafi had a dilapidated military, froze all of his foreign assets. He basically parked it all in T-bills, partially because he tried the hedge fund thing and then got hosed in the 2008 financial crisis. He lost 99% of a $2 billion investment with Goldman Sachs, I think. And then he put it all in T-bills, and then it got frozen 3 years later. Because it was all in treasuries. So he had no money to basically revamp his military. But then, of course, Libya has been a disaster since then because nobody's been able to exert any real control, and the West has largely stopped paying attention. It's that, you're right. It's the overall policy, right? And people have to understand that policy objectives shift over time. They become more or less effective over time too, right? Sanctions may have been useful in 2014 to get the Minsk Accords. I think it would be very reasonable to argue that sanctions should have been used when it became clear Russia was not going to be implementing them in good faith. And that should have been the default, is we're going to keep ratcheting these up on you until you actually implement this in good faith. And maybe that would have had more success. Maybe not. It's hard to argue the hypotheticals, but to me, it always comes back to a discussion of what's foreign policy, and does foreign policy work? Because that's really all this is. So I think it's one tool. It gets a lot of attention because, you get to make angry press releases, and Congress gets to stand up and yell about it, and yada yada yada, which is not as much fun as talking about like the diplomatic negotiations that John Sullivan is trying to have in Moscow, or Nick Burns in Beijing. But it's is what it is, I guess.
Yeah, it goes back to read the reports, not the tweets. Before I let you go, is there an example of a time where sanctions and U.S. foreign policy you feel like we're arm in arm, that should be the one that everybody studies for how to actually use sanctions going forward? Is Libya the example, or is there another one where you feel like the U.S. really teed it up and did it right and it was effective that you can share with us that we should all study up on?
I mean, I think the JCPOA is like the shining example of how sanctions can work, because it was very clear that that's what Iran wanted relief from, is the sanctions. And politically, however you think about the deal, right, in terms of the trade-offs, like, sanctions were used to achieve a limited objective. Nobody overblew what they could or couldn't do with respect to kind of changing the regime in Iran, or the 16-point plan that like Pompeo came out with that was, tantamount to regime change, even though they wouldn't admit it. So like, but I think unfortunately a lot of these are snapshots, right? Like, sanctions were useful in Myanmar when the junta decided that it was sick of China building dams and wanted a little bit more political freedom and economic freedom. They were lifted wholesale, and of course now we're back to basically where we were prior to the sanctions were lifted. So like, unfortunately they're rarely ever like static. I think a lot of people would probably point to the apartheid South Africa as the example when they can be useful. I think if you looked at it contemporaneously, though, you might see more impact, or a lot of impact on ordinary South Africans back then, and less on the elite, which is, I think, what sanctions these days try to flip that as much as they can, where you have more of an impact on the elite, and sometimes you have an impact on the ordinary people too. But it's a little bit of kind of weighing your options. But I do think when you get movement, right, even if that movement doesn't stick, that shows that they can be useful. And if we're all being honest about it, it's not going away. So you may as well try to make it as useful as possible.
Yeah. All right. Well, Brian, I know you got to go back to banging your head against your desk and whatever you were doing before. So thank you so much for making some time. We appreciate you. Maybe come back on at some point in the future when we've got more dumb questions to ask you about sanctions.
No, fun talking to you, for sure.
Thanks for listening to the latest episode of The Perch Pod. If you haven't already, you can find us under the name The Perch Pod on every major streaming platform. Subscribe for downloads, follow us, all that good stuff. If you have feedback on this episode or on any episode, you can email us at info@perchperspectives.com. I can't promise that we'll reply to every single email that comes in, but I read every single one that comes in, and I love hearing from listeners, so please don't be shy. You can find us on social media. Our Twitter handle is @perchperspectives, because we love a good pun. We're also on LinkedIn under Perch Perspectives. Most importantly, please check out our website. It's www.perchperspectives.com. Besides being able to find out more information about the company, the services that we provide, and even to read samples of our work, you can also sign up for our twice-a-week newsletter on the most important political developments in the world. It's free. All you have to do is provide your email address. And even if you don't want to do that, you can read the post for free on our blog. Thanks again for listening. Please spread the word about Perch Perspectives and the Perch Pod, and we'll see you out there.